Hey everybody, Tactic Angel here, back on the PlayStation 4 to take another look at a premium ship in World Warships Legends. Today we will be looking at the somewhat infamous Russian cruiser Aurora, which is a Tier 2 premium ship you may be able to obtain for free right now. As usual, I'll be starting off with a bit of history, we'll move into my thoughts on the ship, then we'll run down all the stats, and finally finish off with some gameplay. I've left a time index down in the description for those of you who might want to jump around. The Aurora is a very famous ship, in part because its long service life, but also because later in its career, it very much became a part of Soviet propaganda. The Aurora was laid down in May 1897, launched surprisingly a full 3 years later in May 1900, and commissioned into service a further 3 years later in July 1903. Part of the reason that the Aurora took as long as it did to construct was that Russia did not have the infrastructure in place for a lot of ship production. Most of their ships were in fact built by England up until that point, which, just like anyone else who was trying to build a navy in the late 19th century, and frankly for about 2 centuries before that too, was the Royal Navy. Having their ship constructed, serviced, and repaired wholly or partially reliant upon their most likely foe represented a fairly obvious disadvantage. As such, the Tsar of Russia, Nikolai II, had ordered the construction of 3 protected cruisers. They would be the first class of modern ships constructed entirely within Russia. These would come to be known as the Palada class of cruisers, and the Aurora was the last of the 3 cruisers completed. Since these 3 cruisers were completed in the early 20th century, all 3 were sent rather quickly to the Pacific Ocean to try to support Russian forces in what would come to be known as the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. The Aurora would take part in the Battle of Tsushima, where the Imperial Russian Navy lost most of the battleships it had brought to the fight, and in total about half of the fleet. One disadvantage about the extremely long construction time for the Aurora was that she was built during a time of rapid naval transformation and development, which meant by the time that she was repaired and refit, she was actually growing long in the tooth by naval standards. Of course, having lost about half of its fleet at Tsushima, the Russians needed just about anything that they could find that floats to constitute a navy. Of course, keeping the ship in port would prove to be a bad idea for Russia when bored and unhappy sailors aboard the Aurora got wrapped up in the coup against the interim government after the deposition of the Tsar. As legend would have it, Aurora fired the first shot that began the October Revolution. Of course, the Aurora was actually disarmed, and what was actually fired was a blank, but for the most part, most of us don't know that, and certainly in early 20th century Russia, even fewer people probably did. By World War II, the Aurora was still in service as a training ship and even saw a bit of combat, somewhat accidentally. The Aurora was docked at St. Petersburg, which the Soviets called Leningrad. When the German army advanced to Leningrad, she would participate in its defense. Attacked by aircraft, she was sunk in September of 1941, but some forward thinking on the part of the commander meant that she came to rest in a shallow section of the harbor. Thus, she was still able to fight. Though she would remain on the bottom of the harbor until the end of the war, the Soviet Union decided to make a symbol of her. She was refloated and attached to the Nakhimov Naval School in St. Petersburg, which is where she remains to this day in a semi-operable state as a museum ship. As for the Aurora in-game, to me she feels like a slightly less survivable, but more maneuverable version of the St. Louis. And so if you want to spend a lot of time playing Tier 2, she's definitely a fun little ship to play with. Of course, since she is a Tier 2 ship, there isn't much for you to actually say about her, other than if you can get her for free, she's totally worth the price. If you can't, these ships tend to come out in $5 bundles a few months after they come out for free. So is it worth it at that point? I think that's a question only you can answer for yourself. How much time do you want to spend down at low tiers, playing for relatively low rewards? While it probably makes the most sense to compare this ship to the Bogatyr, Since the ship has a very similar gun arrangement to the St. Louis and the Charleston, I'm actually going to compare it to those ships primarily. With survivability, you come with just 22,500 hit points, which is about 7,000 less than you'll see on the St. Louis or the Charleston. Your 6 to 152 millimeters of armor is at least better than the St. Louis as it comes to paper, but I consider the lack of an armor viewer here, and my guess is that your 6 inches of armor is actually located only on the conning tower. But the Aurora is one of the better ships, at least on paper, in this regard. Just don't count on it. With 14 152mm guns arranged essentially in a 1 fore and 1 aft position with 6 down either side, the armament of the Aurora is, on paper, very similar to the number and arrangement that you can see on American cruisers like the St. Louis or the Charleston. Its rate of fire is considerably more in line with the St. Louis, being just about 1/3 of a second slower on its reload, rather than a full second on the Charleston. The Aurora actually enjoys a very marginal range advantage over the St. Louis, and more than a kilometer over the Charleston, plus a 1% greater fire chance versus either of those ships. Unfortunately, that does mean it comes with weaker armor-penetrating shells. One thing that's worth mentioning about this ship, since it's not a typical Russian cruiser, this ship does not have good shell arcs, and like a lot of lower tier cruisers, you really do lob shells in there at targets anything over 7 or 8 kilometers, and you will probably struggle a little bit more with the Aurora in this regard than you will on the American ships I've chosen to compare this to. The thing you'll probably notice most here is actually the Aurora can very easily outturn her guns. Even though your fore and aft guns are really the only guns that you have that have more than a limited field of fire, these other deck-mounted guns are actually very slow in turning, which is probably going to get in your way sometimes. And that's hardly surprising considering that Wargaming probably doesn't want to give you, those experienced players, too much of an incentive to drive off the new players. For maneuverability, the Aurora is slow as far as a cruiser goes, actually being slightly slower than the St. Louis or the Charleston, but that 400-meter turning circle is considerably tighter than the St. Louis, and quite frankly, it's probably one of the tightest turning circles in the entire game. The rudder shift here is very comparable. In fact, as far as I can tell, it's exactly the same as what you'd see on a St. Louis or the Charleston. When we look at concealment, you're considerably more visible than similar cruisers at this tier, but basically in line with the other sort of Russian cruisers, which is that you're more likely to get spotted sooner than later. So, in this case, you're around 800 meters more visible, and that goes down a little bit for each one of these categories. So with all that out of the way, let's just jump into a little bit of gameplay. Here we are, we're going to be on Archipelago. There you see the Aurora. Obviously, Aurora has this nice blue camouflage. I actually think it looks quite sharp on the ship. I am pretty positive it's not historic, and in fact you see the same camouflage on several of the other Russian premiums so far, like the Vrhotnik and the Nikolai I. And as we get going, you can see I'm going to try to move up to this island towards B. It looks like we have quite enough people on C, and honestly I don't know if I want to add one more person to that. So I'm going to try to provide some fire support from the side, maybe get people in the crossfire. Usually though, I'll be shooting HE, so it probably won't make too big of a difference where I'm physically located. At least not at this tier. But there you can kind of see relatively short range on the guns. This obviously is made a little bit better by Kuznetsov, who's got that reaching out ability, and also his base trait is increasing the range here, so it's a little bit more comfortable. Now we see the St. Louis, which obviously I compared this to. I'm going to give him a pretty decent lead there. That shot looked like it might be a little long, but we do manage to connect. Set a fire, and that's most of what you're going to be doing in this ship. I'm adjusting my course and speed, just so maybe I draw a couple extra misses. The accuracy on these shells it's not that bad, as you can see. If I were shooting at somebody who's actively dodging, it would be a little bit more difficult to hit because we are kind of lobbing these shells in there. But by the time we get to this sort of range, 8.5, it starts to get a little bit more controllable. Shooting at things out at 11 kilometers is, it's pretty hit or miss. Now we switched over to that Duguay-Touron for no particular reason other than that he's providing the best angle. We are trying to set him on fire. Obviously you can see he used his damage control party, so if we set another fire, it ought to stick, and there we go. And I apologize, there seems to have been some sort of weird jump at a couple of places in this particular recording, and I'm not sure why that is. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. So now our west flank is not doing super great. I'm turning about so that I can help put some shells in on the ships that are on this side of the map. Help even up this fight. As you can see, we have a Kolberg. There is also a Bogater. Now the Bogater is in a really good position to shoot AP against me. And I'm going to try to shoot AP against him, just to see how well it works. Answer, not incredible. We're going to slow down to try to get the most out of that island while we whittle down this Kolberg. And obviously, my go-to here is going to be the HE. It's continuing to do pretty significant damage to the front of that lightly armed cruiser. And we do manage to finish him off. Now I will note, as I'm turning here, since this guy is shooting pretty much exclusively HE back at me, I've decided to go ahead and present a pretty significant broadside to him. You do have to go almost full broadside in order to present all of your guns that can fire in one direction, but you can actually angle just a little bit more than the St. Louis. At this angle, I don't think I'd be able to get all 8 guns firing if I were playing the St. Louis or the Charleston, because that you really do have to be shooting just straight to the side. Now we're running into that HP problem, which is I just don't have enough of it. And in spite of earning the high caliber, we do take an early out to this particular game. Though there are only 2 ships remaining on the enemy team, this actually is going to take quite some time for it to resolve itself. So we're going to just skip to the end in just a second. Overall, I mean, this is a tier 2 ship. I didn't play it 20 or 30 times because I kind of feel bad about doing that at such low tiers, and it feels a little bit like I'm hurting the game if I do that. In any case, if you do like to bomb around at tier 2, it's a decent pickup. I would look in the PlayStation Store or the Xbox Live Store. I'm not sure what you even call it. It should be there in a handy little bundle if you want to pick this up. Anyway, guys, I hope you've enjoyed this little review, and I'll see you on the next one.